There are quite a few ex-members of the clinic who are here today, I'm delighted to say. Now, this is my title, Vaughan's just read out. I've long been interested in what causes a retrograde amnesia to extend back long before the onset of an injury, disease, or traumatic event. Short retrograde amnesias, less than 2 years, tend to correlate with the severity of anterograde amnesia. This is something Narinder Kapoor and I actually agree on. But longer retrograde amnesias probably have a different basis and can cover years or even decades. This topic overlaps, of course, with my interest in confabulation, interest in neurological versus psychogenic amnesia, which we will discuss today, not so much with my interest in forgetting rates, which really apply to anterograde memory disorder. Now, Francis Galton, in the second volume of Brain, a few years before Massoud started editing, wrote, "I propose to give a new instance of psychometry and a few of its results. They may not be of very great novelty or importance, but they are at least definite and admit of verification. Therefore, I trust it requires no apology for offering them to the readers of this journal, who will be prepared to agree with the view that until the phenomena of any branch of knowledge has been subjected to measurement and number, it cannot assume the status and dignity of science." And what he did is he walked down Pall Mall, queuing himself to retrieve autobiographical memories. He dated them, wrote them down, and then quantified them. And interestingly, when he did this, there was something of a reminiscence bump in his self-reporting of these memories. Now, a reminiscence bump, described by David Rubin, is the phenomenon we all experience, that from about the age of 15 to 35, we remember more facts and episodes from our lives than from other periods. And I'm now going to indulge in a bit of reminiscence therapy. I was in Paris from March to May 1968. In those days, I used to process my own black and white photographs, and this is a picture in May 68 of police blockading off the entrance to the Saint-Michel and a man shouting at me. All the roads in those days, the Parisian roads, were made of cobbles, and what happened during the riots is the students dug up the cobbles to make barricades, and then the roads were tarmacked shortly after May 68. Here you can see a traffic light knocked over, and here are the police in their Romanesque helmets and shields. This all looks pretty commonplace nowadays, but actually in those days it was fairly sensational. These are some cars we walked past one morning that had been burned out. This is a man being stopped near the Champs-Élysées and interviewed by the police. And it was after taking this photograph that a policeman came up to me, puce in the face, absolutely furious, demanding to take my camera or my film. And I was very aware there was a black police van off to my right, and a lot of overseas people did get arrested. Now, I knew perfectly well what he was saying, but I just kept saying, "I'm English, I don't understand. I'm English, I don't understand." Until eventually he got bored and let me walk down the Saint-Michel with my friend back to the place where we were staying. So that is a very vivid, episodic memory from my reminiscence bump, to which we will return. Now, retrograde amnesia in neurological disorders, Ribot said that in normal memory, the latest impressions are the most distinct and stable. In other words, there's a recency effect. But in neurological disease, there's the progressive destruction of memory follows a logical order, a law. It begins with the most recent recollections, which being rarely repeated and having no permanent associations, represent organization in its feeblest form. In other words, there's relative sparing of early memories, what we now call a temporal gradient. So, for example, a Korsakoff patient described to me how she'd won a tennis cup at the age of 15, beating gorgeous Gussie on the way, and how after the prize giving, her father said, "A pity your maths isn't as good." On the other hand, she was able to give only a very fragmentary account of her daily life and was unable to recognize me from visit to visit. The first person to look at this phenomenon quantitatively was Elizabeth Warrington, who had a famous faces test and a news events questionnaire, and she found that amnesic patients on recognition testing scored at chance, and on recall testing, they scored at flaw. She said that this was a flat gradient, although there is a flaw effect here. Other people have found a temporal gradient in brain-damaged patients, so that, for example, in HM with bilateral hippocampal resections, he was tested in the early 70s, is doing far worse for the 1960s than for the 1940s. And this patient, PZ, was a well-known professor of social psychology who was rather fond of the bottle. And before he had his Wernicke episode, he wrote his autobiography. After he'd had his Wernicke episode, Butters and Cermak questioned him on facts and events from his book. And you can see there is a very clear temporal gradient. I used the autobiographical memory interview developed with Barbara Wilson and Alan Badley, where we asked about facts and events from childhood, young adult life, and more recently. And you can see that across different types of memory, autobiographical episodes, personal semantic facts, and general semantic knowledge, there was a sort of consistent pattern whereby both patient groups showed a gradient, doing worse for recent than more remote memories, and in general, the Korsakoffs had a steeper gradient than the Alzheimer's, but in both cases, the gradient was statistically significant. And Peter Bright looked at patients with medial temporal lesions, again got a temporal gradient, whereas if the lateral and medial temporal cortex was involved, oh right, sorry, there was a flat gradient. And subsequently, Lara and Miller published a review that showed similar findings. What we found was that actually the association between retrograde and antegrade memory was low, only about 20% shared variance. What was a much better predictor was how participants performed on executive tests, where about 60% of shared variance between performance on retrograde tests and executive function. And consistent with that, when we looked at regional MRI volumes, we found that frontal in particular, and also thalamic in various groups, predicted about 60% of the variance on autobiographical measures. So I'm now going to go on to talk about the main current theories of retrograde amnesia and the temporal gradient. The first is consolidation theory, which says there's a consolidation or structural reallocation such that early memories eventually become independent of the hippocampi and medial temporal lobes, and thereby spared of the effects of medial temporal damage. By contrast, multiple trace theory says that the hippocampi are always involved in the storage, retrieval, and reactivation of episodic memories. And any sparing of early episodic memories is related to the number of traces that have been laid down. And this theory makes two predictions. One is that the extent of hippocampal damage should predict the severity of retrograde amnesia. And the other is that where you've got bilateral extensive hippocampal damage, you should get a flat gradient in episodic memory and a steeper gradient in semantic memory. A third theory is what I call episodic to semantic shift theory, or what Maurice Moscovich calls trace transformation theory, which states that episodic memories, which are vivid and lifelike, acquire a more semantic form, knowledge-based, as they become older, thus protecting them against the effects of brain damage. And more recently, they've postulated the neurobiological basis of this process. But there are various spanners in the works. In consolidation theory, it's not clear how long consolidation lasts, or whether it has any independent markers. Dodai said that it's a continuing and evolving process, whereas Benici and Maguire said it's all over within 2 years. With regard to multiple trace theory, the prediction that the extent of hippocampal damage should predict the severity of retrograde amnesia doesn't really work. I found a lowish correlation which wasn't significant with medial temporal volumes. And 15 years later, the Toronto group acknowledged that the correlation is low. Secondly, they predicted a flat gradient in episodic memory and a steeper gradient in semantic memory. Whereas you've just seen in my study that actually we got a consistent pattern across different types of memory, from the highly autobiographical to general knowledge. And I'll show you the green result in a moment. And in terms of episodic to semantic shift theory, it's not even clear what the specific prediction should be. So in the green study, for personal semantic memory, they actually didn't get much of a temporal gradient, and it wasn't significant. Whereas for episodic memory, they got a steep gradient that was statistically significant. So this was the opposite of what multiple trace theory would predict. In terms of episodic to semantic shift theory, what Winokur and Moscovich described with extensive bilateral hippocampal damage was that patients should show a flat gradient for episodic memory and a steeper gradient for semantic. But they also said that both healthy controls and patients will semanticize their memories as they get older. In other words, you should see fewer and fewer episodic memories as you go backwards in time, and a corresponding increase in semantic memories in both the controls and the patients. So what may be happening is that simply the patient group's curves have shifted downwards, but in parallel. But it's also not clear whether perhaps all remote episodic memories become semanticized in time, so that ultimately you won't have any remote episodic memories. And Gilbert and Moscovich are silent on what their theory is actually predicting in these respects. So having done a job of knocking other people's theories, I want to postulate to you that there's an important retrieval component in retrograde amnesia. This is what actually Elizabeth Warrington said in those early studies. And it would be consistent with the relatively low correlation between the severity of retrograde and anterograde amnesia. It's consistent also with the fact that you get much higher correlations between retrograde amnesia and executive function and or frontal lobe volume on MRI, as I've just shown. It's consistent with the fact that in some studies anyhow, patients show much better performance, disproportionately better, on recognition than recall tests, and disproportionately better on cued than uncued tests. And also it's consistent with the fact that on fMRI, virtually all remote memory studies show frontal activations. Please note, it's quite nice to have a Nobel laureate, a future Nobel laureate, as a junior author on one of your papers. At that stage, he was Eleanor's research assistant, and he did some data analysis for us. Now, a retrieval deficit can be combined with a temporal gradient. We found an age of onset effect in retrograde amnesia, so that in patients younger than 40, there was a relatively flat gradient, whereas patients older than 40 showed a steep gradient. And we interpreted this by saying that it suggested that older participants, but not younger, encode or consolidate new or recent memories in a way that somehow makes them more vulnerable to the effects of brain damage than our earlier memories. Or putting it the other way round, the specific manner in which memories are encoded in earlier life protects those early memories, particularly autobiographical memories, from the effects of subsequent brain damage, giving rise to a temporal gradient in retrograde memory loss. And I suggested that this might reflect the reminiscence bump. And actually, in subsequent papers, Irish and co. and et al., and also Robin Morris and Daniel Mugrabi said things that were related to this. And if you look across at least some studies, not all studies, there is evidence of a reminiscence bump in patients. This is my own study, this is Piolino, this is Irish and co., this is Mosk and Capoletti, this is Harvey Sagar in the 1980s, where he found a reminiscence bump for the age of 20 in controls and Parkinson's, and for the teens in Alzheimer patients. In Aarhus, Fromholt, and Larson got patients to give a narrative life history talking about events that had been important in their lives. And when they counted the number of events recalled across decades, you can see that there is clear reminiscence bump in controls, but also in dementia patients. And when they looked at the proportion of memories recalled across decades, then in depressed, dementing, and the very elderly, they found very clear reminiscence bump. And I also collaborated with other researchers in the Aarhus group using an expanded version of the autobiographical memory interview. And you can see that we found quite a wide reminiscence bump going from childhood to early 20s, preserved in Alzheimer patients, that was statistically significant. So summarizing the Burton study, we found a robust reminiscence bump in the recall of autobiographical episodes and also personal semantic facts. We argued that this was facilitated by better encoding, greater rehearsal, and reduced retrieval demands of what Berntsen calls the demands of cultural life scripts, events that take place in those years. And we argued that, in turn, this facilitated the recovery and retrieval of genuinely episodic autobiographical memories and might be the basis of the rebotemporal gradient. What is generally agreed is that remote procedural memories, skill-based memories, are often preserved in Alzheimer patients. And I'm hoping to show you a clip taken from YouTube of a New York former prima ballerina 60 years later when she's in a care home with dementia. I think that's wonderful every time I see it. So, summarizing what I've said about neurological retrograde amnesia, there are still unresolved issues, like how long does consolidation last, and what does it contribute, if at all, and what are the patterns across episodic and semantic memory. Frontal and lateral temporal, and possibly even parietal damage can contribute to retrograde amnesia, as well as hippocampal damage, and the interactions between these structures are beginning to be explored. RA may reflect a retrieval deficit with the temporal gradient, perhaps reflecting the presence of a reminiscence bump. And remote procedural memories tend to be preserved in AD. So I'm now going to talk about psychogenic amnesia, defined in both DSM and ICD as dissociative amnesia with or without fugue. But I prefer a more descriptive neuropsychological classification. They can either be global psychogenic amnesias encompassing the entire earlier life, plus or minus the loss of personal identity, which is transient in a fugue state and more persistent in what I call psychogenic focal retrograde amnesia. Or they can be situation-specific gaps in memory for specific events without loss of personal identity, as occurs in PTSD, some victims of crime, and even some perpetrators of offences. And reviewing the literature, I've suggested in a couple of review papers that there are a number of factors that have been identified. There's usually severe precipitating stress, although the patient won't tell you about this initially. And it could be a marital or financial crisis being charged with an offence. There's very often depressed mood and or suicidal ideas. And surprisingly common, there's a past history of a transient neurological amnesia, such as from a minor head injury, epilepsy, or alcohol. A fugue state is essentially a syndrome consisting of a sudden loss of memory involving autobiographical memories and the sense of personal identity, usually associated with a period of wandering, normally lasts a few hours or days, up to about a month, and there's a subsequent amnesic gap for the period of the fugue. So patient E came around in the central London park, didn't recall who he was or any past memories. Found by the police, he was brought to St Thomas's A&E and admitted. Physical investigations were all normal. Memories started slowly to return. He recollected first his forename and then his surname, which was primed when a doctor called out his first name. Having identified him, we contacted his relatives. He disappeared from home 8 days earlier, following a combination of marital and employment crises. He was treated for depression, and within a positive therapeutic environment, he recovered his memories for the past, although not for the 8 days of his disappearance. Now, focal retrograde amnesia is a term that was coined by Narendra Kapoor, and strictly it refers to retrograde amnesia in the absence of any anterograde memory loss. Unlike fugue, the memory disorder persists. Sometimes it's initially accompanied by a transient loss of personal identity. It's often, but not always, follows a mild concussion or minor cerebral event. Early reports were assumed to reflect underlying brain pathology, but brain imaging is usually normal, and I argued strongly in 2000 that many of these cases, there were hints in a lot of the reports, might well be psychogenic, possibly even all of them. So patient F collapsed at work and was admitted to hospital with the physical signs suggestive of a minor stroke. Only small vessel disease was found on his MRI, and the physical signs resolved within 24 hours. He was left with an apparently profound autobiographical memory loss and initially the sense of personal identity. He'd collapsed when being dismissed from one of his jobs. He'd been employed in 2 employments simultaneously. They found out, informed each other, and he was sacked. With support from his family and with treatment for underlying depression, he was able to retrieve most of his memories over the next 3 months. There was just a gap for the last 18 months before his problem. Then there's a third group that I call fugue to FRA. They begin like a fugue state. They experience an initial fugue-like episode, sudden loss of personal identity, profound autobiographical amnesia, and a period of wandering. But then the amnesia persists, and it looks more like focal retrograde amnesia. So this lady, who we wrote up in 1994, left Galveston, Texas, following a marital crisis. She came round on the London Tube, complaining of amnesia, was directed to a police station and then to hospital. Her severe amnesia persisted for more than a year, and following identification from the Missing Persons Bureau, I spoke to her family in Texas, and she was helped to recover her memories. But she also remained amnesic for the first 8 days of her disappearance. So we wrote up a few years ago 53 psychogenic cases. This is the largest series in the modern literature. There were 16 psychogenic fugue, 16 psychogenic focal retrograde amnesia, 16 fugue to FRA, 5 with gaps in their memory, and we compared them with 21 neurological memory disorder patients and 14 healthy controls, reviewing the case notes and neuropsychological test scores. And we were looking in particular in the case notes for the things that had been suggested in my review of the literature. So we looked, for example, was there loss of personal identity, any previous episodes of psychogenic amnesia, any neurological history, past or precipitating head injury, depression, PTSD, somatization, problems in childhood, including child sexual abuse. And what we found was that loss of personal identity only occurred in the psychogenic case. Also, much more common in the psychogenic cases was a failure to recognize family members. By definition, there was a neurological history in all the neurological cases, but very interestingly, a past or recent precipitating minor head injury was present in 41% of the psychogenic and 10% of the neurological cases. Also, consistent with the literature, there were significantly higher rates of depression, marital or family problems, financial or employment problems, or forensic problems in the psychogenic cases. There were non-significant trends for a higher rate in the psychogenics of PTSD, somatization, childhood problems, including sexual abuse, and substance or alcohol misuse. So these are potential precipitating factors, and I meekly suggest, very meekly, that they might even be relevant in FCD. Now, we looked at anterograde memory scores, and we tested people just as they were coming out of their amnesia, which are labeled during here, and 3 to 6 months later. And you can see that across verbal and visual recall and recognition memory, there was a 10 to 15 point difference. They improved over time, and that was statistically significant for verbal recall memory. I was particularly interested in what the pattern of retrograde memory loss. And you can see here that fugue patients, this is personal semantic facts, where they went to school, who their friends were at particular time periods. Fugue patients' curve was flat in that it was down parallel to the controls, whereas the two FRA groups showed what I call a reversed temporal gradient, whereas neurological patients do better for remote than recent memories. For the two FRA groups, they did better for recent than remote. And 3 to 6 months later, the fugue had recovered. They're doing as well as controls. The FRA had also substantially improved, but they still showed this reversed temporal gradient. Looking at incidents or events, again, the fugue showed a relatively flat curve, and the two FRA showed a reversed temporal gradient. And at 3 to 6 months follow-up, the fugue had improved, although this time not quite to normal, and the FRA had also improved, but they still showed this reversed temporal gradient. So summarizing, in fugue, the memories returned to normal for facts and near normal for episodes, and there was a lesser improvement in focal retrograde amnesia with a reversed temporal gradient still. And we said that this was consistent with a process of inhibition in memory retrieval, which later improves or recovers. Now, I've put forward a model to account for this, and this model deliberately incorporated psychosocial factors and brain systems. And in the model, there's a precipitating stress. The patient is often depressed, occasionally aroused, and there's often been a past episode of a transient neurological amnesia, such as a minor head injury, which I see as a kind of learning experience. And when this happens, you get inhibition of retrieval of facts and episodes from autobiographical memory, and in extreme cases of the sense of self or identity, in which case there's a kind of negative feedback loop whereby instead of being described as depressed or aroused, the patients are described as looking flat or perplexed. Now, they seem to operate normally in the environment, suggesting that the medial temporal system is operating normally, but it can't be completely normal because when they recover from the fugue, they don't remember what they were doing when they were in it. Now, this model is broadly consistent with Mike Anderson's findings, which he was looking at anterograde memory, but his studies of memory inhibition and suppression suggested that there is activation of frontal inhibitory systems and deactivation of medial temporal systems. And Kikuchi looked at this in 2 psychogenic patients, and Laura Marsh has reanalyzed the Kikuchi data, showing reciprocal interactions between dorsolateral frontal systems and the hippocampus. What patients say, and these are 2 different patients, are things like, it's like a box locked away and I don't really want to open it. Or I put things in boxes. I choose to put them in the back of my mind. I've always done that. I know the memories are there, but I just cannot get access to them. Now, this is rather like Rivers' quotes about First World War shell shock state cases. He said, many kinds of mental experience may be repressed. Thus, one of my patients was attempting to banish from his mind feelings of shame due to his having broken down. In another case, the officer had carried the repression of grief through the wall to the point of suppression. In nearly every case, they were either deliberately thrusting unpleasant thoughts from their minds or occupating every moment of the day in some activity so that these thoughts might not come into the focus of attention. This is consistent with what the early Freud was saying, but not the later Freud, and it's consistent also with some of Mike Anderson's views on memory inhibition and memory suppression. So, summarizing, I've said that psychogenic amnesias, well, I haven't said this, but they can be interpreted at different levels. And I've focused on the neuropsychological or cognitive. Other people look at different aspects. And I've described 4 syndromes: fugue, psychogenic FRA, fugue to FRA, and situation-specific gaps in memory. They seem to involve the avoidance of unpleasant or painful memories arising in particular psychosocial contexts, and the context is important, which involves a severe precipitating stress, depressed mood and suicidal ideas, and sometimes a past learning episode consisting of a transient minor neurological amnesia, such as from trivial head injury. And they may involve the frontal inhibition of autobiographical memory retrieval with compromised new memory formation, and there is some neuroimaging support for this hypothesis. Overall, I would argue that there are still unresolved issues in neurological retrograde amnesia, but frontal and lateral temporal damage contribute as well as hippocampal pathology. And I've suggested a retrieval deficit with a temporal gradient secondary to age effects at encoding, perhaps in turn related to the reminiscence bump. Psychogenic amnesia may involve the frontal inhibition of autobiographical memory retrieval with compromised new memory formation, and there's some neuroimaging support for this. Taken together, these observations point to the importance of frontal control systems in the retrieval, and more particularly the disrupted retrieval of old memories. It's not all hippocampus. Finally, in the 1980s, Alistair Burns and colleagues conducted a study in dementia patients from which they concluded that the last thing to go before impending death was Margaret Thatcher. The good news is that, in my case, when I develop a retrograde amnesia, then according to my very own theory, the last thing to go will be my memories of the events in Paris, '68. Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you, Mike. We've got time for a couple of questions. Siraj? Oh, sorry, go for it.
Hi, thank you very much for fascinating talk. Every time I hear you talk, I learn something new. I'm one of the trainees from your clinic. My question is, psychogenic fugue as a presentation. So I remember seeing cases maybe over 20 years, 25 years ago. And despite working and leading a service in a large regional neuroscience center, I haven't seen any case in last 15 years or maybe 20 years of psychogenic fugue. And I wonder whether presentation has changed and why that might be. Is it shaped by societal preoccupation with different kind of memory problems? Or do you have any observations about that? Or is it that I'm in less glamorous part of London in Tooting, and maybe I don't get, people traveling from Texas to Tooting, maybe?
Well, that is important. The reason we got so many is that they tend, for some reason, to come in by the railways to the railway stations, or they were found in the London parks. And so they were brought to St Thomas's. And that's how I built up such a largish sample. Whether the incidence has changed over the years, I don't know. There's simply not good enough data on that.
Masood?
Mike, that was a beautifully clear talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering about the bump, the reminiscence bump. Wouldn't people who are proponents of the consolidation or the multiple trace theory says that begs the question of what leads to the reminiscence bump? What is the mechanism for the reminiscence bump? Couldn't we just explain it away by consolidation theory or multiple trace theory?
I don't think you can explain it in terms, certainly of multiple trace theory, and probably not consolidation theory because of its shape. But there is a lot of debate as to what leads to it. And it's probably fair to say that nobody really knows. My collaborator, Dorth Bernsen, argues that we all have a lot of critical life events, leaving school, going to university, first girlfriend, getting married, children, around that time period, and they act as markers that help us remember from that time period. But there is a lot of debate as the basis of the bump. What doesn't seem to be debated is the fact that it exists. That, unusually in psychology, is actually accepted by most people. Now, I was asking myself last night, what question is Narinder Kapoor going to ask? So should we give him the chance?
I can't see you, Narinder. Do you have your hand up? I think we'll give the last question to Narinder in that case.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. Just a couple of questions. First of all, your views on transient epileptic amnesia, because in theory, that can give you what looks like focal retrograde amnesia. Obviously, you get accelerated long-term forgetting in TEA, but I was just wondering your thoughts on that. And secondly, when we have anterograde memory and memory loss, we've got performance validity tests to rule out malingering. Do you think for retrograde amnesia, there's any equivalent test to rule out malingering for psychogenic retrograde amnesia?
You always have to think of it. and the longer it goes on, the more suspicious one becomes. I made myself unpopular in Hay on Wye one year. They showed this film called something, oh, I can't remember, but it was about a young Brit in New York who filmed himself having his psychogenic amnesia. And I was asked to talk about the film. And I thought I was pulling my punches rather carefully, but the director was furious with me afterwards because this guy was obviously putting it on. And part of the reason why I think he was putting it on was he was saying, oh, the sea, well, what's the sea? And his general semantic knowledge was affected. The convincing cases, it's confined to episodic memory. And occurs in certain circumstances. But one always has to have the possibility of malingering